The reality is, if you're doing what God has wired you to do, it's way bigger than you think.
Hi, welcome back to another week of Behind and Beyond, where we discuss the sermon from the past weekend. I'm Allison, and this week we get to sit down with an extra special guest, Dave Buehring. If you haven't yet heard the sermon from this past week, now is where I'd say you should pause this, go listen to the sermon, and then jump back into this conversation after that so you can join us. Dave is a longtime friend and partner to Northway, discipling both members of our congregation and our ministry staff as well. He is involved in so many things, and so I'm just going to read it all off because I don't want to miss it. Dave is the founder and president of Lionshare, a nonprofit organization aimed at igniting and equipping churches and societal leaders to fulfill Jesus' great commission of disciple makers. He's also the author of The Great Opportunity, Making of Disciples of Jesus in Every Vocation, and a Discipleship Journey, a practical resource used for spiritual formation around the world. Dave annually hosts and teaches a 6-month leadership intensive for vocational leaders called A Leadership Journey. Additionally, he hosts his own podcast, Wisdom Unlocked: The Ways of God. It is a great conversation. We look forward to you joining us. Well, hi, Dave. Welcome to the podcast. So great to have you here.
It's good to be with you.
You preached all day on Father's Day, so kind of not a super restful Father's Day for you.
It's okay.
But in honor of Father's Day, I thought maybe we could start with a dad joke or two. Your Adam belly button joke that you slipped in there got a lot of laughs.
That's the one, when Dave was taking me to the airport, he said, I missed something in the first service that you said that was everybody laughed at, and I couldn't even remember what it was, but that's what it was. You're right.
Oh, my 4th grader he was like, I've never thought about that. So it was a big hit in our house. So I thought I would start. Do you have a dad joke, a favorite dad joke off the top of your head?
Let's see. No, I don't know that anything's coming to my head. It used to be back in the day when, you know, uh, Elvis Presley was, still alive. It was like, what's green and sings? Have you heard that one? Elvis Parsley?
No.
Yeah, oh yeah.
Oh.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So there's,
That's a good dad joke.
yeah, that's a good dad joke. So yes,
Yeah.
I often have some, for my grandkids from time to time, but I'm blanking at the moment, so I must not have
Yeah.
anything in front of me, but we'll just go with Elvis Parsley for now.
That's a great one. I'd never heard that one. And
Yeah.
actually, my husband he teaches 10th grade English, and he does
Yeah.
a dad joke a day.
Really?
Yes, for his students. And so our house is really full of them. So I asked him to give me his top dad joke. So I've got one for you.
Okay.
I can't remember these things. They don't stick in my mind, but
Yeah.
he can just fire them off. So let's see. What happened when I stepped on a grape?
I don't know.
Not too big. No, it wasn't too big of a deal. It just let out a little whine.
There it is. That's a good jad joke, right? Is there's a little bit of laughter with a little bit of like, oh. Well, you
I
have
don't
to
think I
go
can
home.
deliver it.
No, you did good. You did good. You'll have to go home
Okay.
and do the Elvis Parsley and see how he responds to that.
Yes, I will. I'll bring that one home. I feel like I don't have the same dad delivery. I'll have to.
No,
Carlo
you
can
did
add
good.
some like drums in the background or something.
No,
a laugh track. Can you do a laugh track in there?
Yeah, you created again, I think a good dad joke is a chuckle, but a bit of a shaking of the head or a rolling of the eyes. So you did that. You accomplished that.
No, thanks. Well, Dave, I'm just going to start you off. We're going to talk about the sermon from the past weekend. I'm going to start you off with the one question that I ask everybody every week,
Okay.
which is just if you had more time, is there anything else that you would have liked to work into the sermon, or any other directions you were thinking about going but kind of had to cut due to time limits? Anything else? This is kind of like your opportunity to say anything else you would have liked to have said on
Yeah.
Sunday but didn't really
Yeah.
have space for.
I think I would have like I think one of the places where the Lord wanted me to land, and I felt like people were receiving really well, was the passivity issue.
Mm,
And one of the things that probably had I had more time, like I mentioned that oftentimes if I'm doing a men's retreat, this would be one of the topics I like to address, and I'll take more time on it and kind of unpack it. But like we didn't get a chance to talk about how Abraham, this was actually passed on to his son, like Isaac and Rebecca. It was kind of an instant replay. And my point I'm making is that I think it's a generation, can be a generational stuck place, and I've watched where, let's just say, great granddad to dad to son, that I was sharing this with somebody this morning. We just kind of got on a topic of this, and there's a young lady here's who's an intern for Lion Share Leadership Group this year, and we were talking about this, and it was really interesting because she totally identified. I said, you often see what can happen is like when we get out of our maybe lanes of how God's made us, a man can step into passivity instead of stepping up. And because of that vacuum, oftentimes I've watched women step in because they feel really responsible and nobody's doing it. So it's like I honor that, but then what it can slip and slide into is control. And where women can wrestle with control and men can wrestle with passivity. And some of that is generational. It's almost like a generational stuck place that we can say, God, we repent, we own this, we ask you to forgive us, and would you just break this off of our lives? And so, had we had more time, I think some of those layers of understanding may have helped people just realize, hey, this isn't just me. Because all of a sudden, when oh, this is no. Every guy that I have ever met, if they're honest, there's a layer of passivity. It's just a matter of how big is it in their life, or what category do they tend to wrestle with.
mm. Yeah, maybe we could actually. I have a question about that. Maybe we could
Yeah,
camp out there for a minute. I
yeah,
was thinking about passivity. I think we would say, or culture would say, the opposite of passivity is aggressiveness. And so you see this story of Abraham, and he's passive, and his wife gets taken by two different men.
yeah,
But then we've got Peter, and he's not passive at all, and he's like cutting off men's ears. So
yes.
it feels like that's a big
It's a
a big
huge,
spectrum.
yep,
And then meanwhile, we see Christ like on the way to the cross. I think a viewer could think he's being passive. He's being questioned about things. Um, and he's choosing not to answer.
yep,
But it's really meekness, right? And so I'm curious if there's so much power in the way Christ is choosing to intentionally engage in a way that is meek. He's not just being passive, even though it might look like
yeah,
passivity to someone on the outside. So I'm wondering if you could just even break that down a little bit, the
yeah,
difference between passivity and meekness,
yeah.
and how to operate in a place of meekness.
Yeah, and I think too, Allison, that it's like the opposite of passivity is, as I teased the other day, it's not painting your face blue and screaming freedom like Braveheart. It's actually
Yeah.
stepping into responsibility, right? And
Hmm.
so I think with even Jesus in that moment that you're describing really well, he was stepping into his responsibility, and his responsibility in that moment was to the Father and the kingdom. It wasn't Pilate, you
Yeah.
know? And so when I look at that, it's like I even see that same strength, because sometimes with um the opposite of passivity being responsibility, you recognize the moment that you're in and you give yourself fully to it. And that's what Jesus was doing. So, yes, it very much could be meekness, but I also look at it as the other expression of passivity is of responsibility, that he is being responsible before the Father and the sake of the kingdom. I can't even imagine the weight of that moment of Jesus realizing what is coming. I just watched with Cheryl last night the first episode of this new season of The Chosen. And have you seen it by chance?
No, not this season.
Yeah,
No.
so it just came out. I think the first three are now out on Amazon Prime, and and it's really interesting because it's you're seeing Jesus dealing with the reality, like he pauses on the donkey before going into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday and you can see grief starting to land on him, and both Mary Magdalene and I think it was John stop and they just look at him, and he's dealing with, and then he kind of looks at them and gives them a smile, and let's move ahead. And you see him preaching on that day, and you see just him beginning to be overwhelmed with grief. And the reality is Jesus stepped up and into that moment to be responsible for why he came. And so I even see his choice of being quiet there, of staying focused on why he came, and not even letting those things, because he said, my father could send armies, down right now. But I think the question to always ask is to determine if someone's walking in passivity or responsibility is, are they stepping up to the moment and into the moment? And the moment you described so well, Jesus is doing exactly that.
Mm. So you're kind of reframing it. You're really saying, if I'm understanding correctly, like aggressiveness isn't the opposite of passivity.
No.
Responsibility is.
Yes. Yes.
Hmm.
Yeah. It's being so, like, for a man, what passivity can do is he can procrastinate his way out of not doing something. Or as I mentioned on Sunday, you can swim in lingering boyhood. I just want to do fun things, pleasurable things, and not the hard stuff. And so the opposite of passivity is never aggressiveness. The opposite is being responsible for what God is asking you to step up to.
Mm. I think that even frames up what I know about you so well, Dave. Even I was talking to someone who was just kind of thinking about your sermon and kind of processing it with me. And they were saying how they felt like you were speaking so well towards uh, who they felt like they should be as a man, but not in a way
Mhm.
that felt aggressive or
Oh,
felt
good.
like and so you even it was an example of stepping, I think, into responsibility. And I'm
Mm.
curious about with you. I
Hmm.
know that you have now like almost 4 decades of kind of stepping into your responsibility as a disciple maker of other disciples. And so I would love, would you mind just, I know this isn't something you get to share much in like a sermon
Yeah.
capacity, but would you share a little bit about maybe your own journey of how the Lord has formed your heart for discipleship in men, but also women as well, and
Yeah.
vocational discipleship, and kind of what that journey has been for you and how you've chosen to follow the Lord in that?
Yeah. Yeah. So I grew up in a home, Allison, where I had a mom that would get up and pray at 4:30 in the morning for her husband and her two sons, and for the nations. And so I early on recognized that I was in a situation that all I could do is be thankful for. And then I watched when, let me just get the age right. I would have been 13 years old when my dad, who is a very successful business guy, this has been 1973, decided to leave business and go back to Bible college. And,
Mm,
it's not unusual now that somebody older goes back to school, but back at that time, when he went back to Northwestern College in Minneapolis, St. Paul area, he was one of two people who were in their 40s. And they were the
mm.
oldest in the school because he just didn't do that back then. But
Yeah, right.
I watched my dad obey. So I watched mom pray, I watched dad obey, and early on in my life that began to shape some things. So I always encourage parents, it's like, just know your kids are watching. Your kids can be deeply impacted by the choices that you make. And that was certainly true for me. And when I was a junior in high school, my dad was invited by Lauren Cunningham, who is the founder of Youth of the Mission, YWAM, to come for a month with about, I think it was like 50, 60, 70 other people to just spend a month with Lauren. So, like Monday to Friday, for 4 weeks, they spent time and he taught and poured into them. Well, I mean, we weren't just going to let dad be the only one to go to Hawaii. So, my mom and my
Yeah.
brother and I, and dad had gone with a friend, his family, we in the middle of it all went for 10 days. And I could still point to the exact place where I my dad introduced me to Lauren. And during that conversation, I was a junior in high school, and he said, "So Dave, what do you think you're supposed to do after high school?" He said, and I said, "I want to go into television broadcasting." And he said, "That's awesome." But he said, "Can I challenge you to do something before you do that?" And He said, I would invite you and challenge you to consider coming here and to go to a discipleship training school, which was 3 months of discipleship and then 2 months you do an outreach. And so I listened to him. I said, okay, well, thank you for that invite. And how do I do that? And so he explained that to me. So I go back, finish my junior year, and then in the fall of my senior year, I start doing all the applications to the University of Minnesota, got accepted there, then to YWAM, got accepted there. My mom and dad were wise enough not to say a whole lot, but I know they were praying. And I made the choice to go to Kona, put off my acceptance at the University of Minnesota for a year, but I ended up, Allison, being there 7 years. And it was during that time that Lauren had spent time with a friend of his by the name of Bill Bright. Bill's the guy that founded what we now know as Crew. Of course, you know that. And then Francis Schaeffer, who ran something in Lausanne, Switzerland. That was a little bit more of a godly thinking and worldview. And they were comparing notes. And Bill Bright and Lauren in Colorado during that summer said, just kind of shop talk, like, hey, what's the Lord been speaking to you about? And they both said the spheres of society. And so they talked about how there was family, church, government, education, arts, entertainment, sports, media, and business. Same seven. And so it became known as the seven spheres. And that was 1975. And right after high school for me, Allison, in 77 is when I joined YWAM. So it was right as they were launching that. And so for me, because I wanted to be in the media in my DTS, they had a media group, so that's what I was in. But it was my first exposure to the reality that God is just not involved in church and missions, but he wants to express himself through our lives in society within what we call the vocations today. And so that was kind of the launching pad for me back in 1977 to 84 as a 18 to 25-year-old that started shaping things that I do today.
Mm. And then can you speak a little bit towards that? So now you continue to work. Like, how has the Lord grown that in you? You work to help disciple people in their vocations,
Yeah, so
kind of all around the world.
yeah, and so it's like for me there's kind of a leader side of my life, speaker side of my life, and there's this disciple making thing which I think we're all to be involved in. And as I was pastoring, um I found that everybody, of course, that I was meeting with, you found out like hey, what do you do for a living? Is, of course, the language we use.
Hmm.
And so as I begin to talk with them, you know, I would find myself saying, hey, have you ever considered how to reproduce the things of God that you live in your life through your vocation and within the people you work with who love Jesus? And those that don't, that it creates kind of a godly DNA for them to see and experience and to taste. And that just began to grow throughout particularly the 1990s in my heart.
Hmm.
And it was in the early 2000s that the Lion's Share Leadership Group, which is the organization I have the privilege of leading, we founded and started. And that has been a core slice of that. Now for next year will be our 25th anniversary. And so a lot of it for us, Allison, is it begins with recognizing that God's character is revealed through the vocations. And so, like in a book I did called The Great Opportunity, it talks about those pieces and how, for example, like I was telling Dave the other day as we were talking about this, that if you're gifted in communication or writing or whatever the case may be, Jesus is the Word. It's like it's in there. If you are creative, God is the creator of all things. So when you see the giraffe with the long neck or the zebra with stripes, he's the one that decided, I'm just going to do this and that, right? The sunsets I see in Hawaii or the sunrises, it's like oftentimes I'm thinking of, wow, Lord, that is amazing, right? How you did that. And you go through the different vocations, Allison, and it's amazing how you can discover that God's character is expressed through the vocations. Like he's a builder. He's the one, like why didn't he just tell Noah build an ark? He gave him specific dimensions. He gave him the kinds of wood, everything. And so like
Hmm.
if you're a builder, God gets you. If you're a person in government, he's the King of Kings and Lord. He knows how to govern. So I think that's where we can short sell our vocations. And well, if someone's a pastor or missionary, obviously they're doing the work of God. Eh. The reality is, if you're doing what God has wired you to do, it's way bigger than you think.
Yeah, I think I find that so fascinating. And it's so interesting to think about how the Lord wants us to grow and has maybe even called us into our specific vocations, um, and given us the gifts to do them, and how
Yeah.
we're supposed to live as disciples in those vocations. I think sometimes there is this split of
Yes.
our personhood where we're one person at home or in the church and a different person at work. And
Yeah.
so, how would you even suggest, let's say someone maybe in an older generation is thinking a little bit about these things that you're talking about, both the vocation and calling piece, maybe, but also maybe they're seeing some passivity in a younger generation that they'd want to mentor. Where should they get started? How do they begin to think about caring and being a spiritual father or spiritual mother to someone in a younger generation?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I like first for me, it's as the older person, let's say if you were a man in this situation, um, and you deal with your own passivity first, right? It's like be honest about it. Where do you struggle? Where does this kind of raise its head? And that allows you to have an opportunity to kind of deal with it in your own heart. But I think the next step is, and I find this interesting, Allison, a lot of people, let me just say, generally speaking, 50s and older, when I ask them, like what we do with something with Lionshare called the leadership games, which is older discipling younger, some of the leaders that come, like they walk through discipleship journey, our discipleship tool with people in, say, business or arts or government or media, whatever it is, for a year to prepare them to pour into 20s and 30s. But when I ask them to invite some 20s and 30s they know, I would say half of them know somebody like that they'd invite. But to be really honest, the other half is more like, Dave, I'm doing this because I care about the next generation, but I don't have any relationships with them, which
Mm-hmm.
is
Mm-hmm.
saddening and sometimes surprising to me. The only ones that they would is I have grandkids, but beyond that, I just don't. And so, I really think it's important. I mentioned this the other day in the sermon that I think it's really important that we take the time, if you are, let's just call you 50 and older, that you start paying attention to those in their 20s, 30s, and 40s and just start building relationship. Don't be the expert. Just be someone with a father's heart, or if you're a woman, a mother's heart, and just begin to build relationships. Sincerely care. I find that a lot of our 20s and 30s in particular are carrying things that are not easy. Like I just came from a lunch with somebody who's about 32 years of age, and they have a 3-year-old daughter or 2-year-old daughter right now who he said's in the screaming stage and the tantrum stage. He's looking at me like, how do I? And I just said, first of all, his name is JJ. I said, JJ, just so you know, you're going to get over this. This too shall pass. But it's an opportunity of God exposing things in your child that now you can shape, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you could tell for him that was gold. It was just gold. And so I think a lot of times older folks um, don't realize maybe the little pieces of wisdom that you think are this big could be this big in a younger leader's ears if you're willing to just
Yeah.
give them time and build a relationship.
Yeah, and I think that that younger, my experience with younger people is that they are really hungry to hear from an older generation. And I
Yeah,
don't know that older generations even know that or maybe feel insecure kind of like engaging those relationships, but I work at one of the campuses that has a lot of young people at it, and it like the questions for older people to mentor them like never stop. There's just
yeah,
always they're hungry for it
yeah,
and hungry for someone to pour into them, I think.
yeah.
Um,
I think you're right. Can I just say one thing on this?
yes, please.
So
Yeah.
I have a man that's he's about 15 years older than me. He's now 80. And probably about 15 years ago, so he would have been, actually, now that I think about this, he was about my age. He was about 65 then. I was 50. And he said this to me. He said, Dave, so just realize that a lot of older folks, they never had discipling, mentoring. It was all just kind of pull yourself up by your bootstraps, as the old saying used to go, and just kind of suck it up and make it through. So when you ask older, and now he would say those primarily like mid 70s and olders, they never even had a taste of discipling, spiritually mentoring. So he
Mm-hmm.
said they just don't know how. And so I was going in to speak to a seniors group at a church I was at, and they just said, Hey, would you? I said, sure. So the only way I started to sow some seeds there of a little bit about pouring into, and I could tell it's like, hello, I'm not connecting. So I switched gears and I said, how many of you, because most of them were grandmothers there, said, how many of you know how to bake an amazing pie? And all the grandmas kind of looked down and went like this, right? And then to the guys, I said, how many of you started a business or involved in starting a business? And most of the men raised their hands. And I said, do you know how much Starbucks you'd be able to suck down from young people that will pay for a cup of coffee to learn just those things from you? And then I had their attention. They looked at me and they didn't know. I said, "Oh yeah. They would love to learn like so they don't have to make the same, decisions you made that were wrong to learn from you." And you could tell it was like I hit the right spot and they were like, "Oh." And I said, "And by the way, this was again 15 years ago. But I said, by the way, some of you have heard of this thing called texting. Oh, yeah, but I don't know how to do it. They'll show you. Oh, so then they realized there was mutual value, right? And so we just have to, I think you've made a great observation, and I have found that to be very, very true. And so a lot of my journey right now is trying to mobilize people in their 40s to 70s to invest in the 20s and 30s, because you're right, they want that. But I don't think we have enough older leaders that are willing to give the time. So that's part of my mission right now is mobilizing the older. Yeah.
Mm. So you spent some time with our staff last week on a
Mm,
Wednesday, and
hmm.
I missed it, unfortunately, because I was at the Swickley Valley Kids
Yeah.
gig, but I've heard a lot of great things about it. And I know it had a lot to do with character development. And I thought it was interesting, even in your sermon. I know this is like important to you, and in your sermon, when you walked through the examples of Abraham, you used character as like defining him first. So faithful follower, loving leader, humble warrior. Um, I believe what I've heard through the grapevine, anyway, from missing that time with our staff, is that you were talking a little bit about even character development, kind of in your 20s, 30s, 40s, and how that's shaping you for what God might want to do in your 50s and 60s. I'm
Hmm.
wondering if you could speak a little bit about that here and maybe
Yeah.
even give some of that wisdom that you gave to our staff team to our whole church right here.
Yeah. Yeah. I'd be happy to. So let me just get the math right here, Allison. So it was about 1994, 95. I ran across a book that was called The Making of a Leader and is written by a guy by the name of Dr. Bobby or Robert Clinton. And I read it. And then as I started going back to school in 1997, just to kind of sharpen my own life up a little bit, I pursued a master's degree and I had this opportunity to do, I think it was two classes that I could pick. And so I was going to Regent University and I was kind of doing the modular thing and the back and forth driving and all that. But at a campus in Oklahoma City, Bobby was going to do a 1 week modular Monday to Friday. And so I wrote to the folks at Regent and said, look, could I make this one of my two things that I could jump into and do? And they said, yeah, you could just do the paperwork on it. And so I go to Oklahoma City and there's about 60 of us there. And Bobby walks in. He would have been probably the age I am now, or about that age. And he said, "Hey, I'm Bobby. Glad you're here. Would you all do me a favor? Would you count off by threes?" So we literally go down. There was 3 rows of 20. We all one, two, three, and then at the end he said, "Thank you. Now would all the twos please stand?" So they stand. Of course, it's 1/3 of the people. And he said, "Here's what I want you to hear." He said, from my research from scripture, church history, and today of 1,300 leaders, spiritual leaders, only 1 in 3 finish well. Well, he had our attention. And he said, I know there's some of you here that are like I at the time would have been like 38 years of age. So he says, some of you are young and you're trying to understand how God develops us in seasons. He said, there's some of you that are older that you now will have some things to be reflective on. And he said, and I know there's some of you here that this might be your last stab at trying to stay in the fight. And so we spent that Monday to Friday about 8 hours a day digging in. And then Allison, at the end of it, I had to do a paper on my life. But what Bobby did is he gave this grid, and would you like me just to kind of give the little version of the timeline?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so this is
Yeah.
kind of what I shared with the staff was so Bobby, here's what he found. So if you kind of make this your birth date and this your heaven going, and he says this is the timeline of your life. If you live well into your 60s, most people go through about 5 seasons of life. And I'll just kind of make this brief, but here's what it is. The first season he calls Sovereign Foundations. It's from when you're born to about the first time you're on your own, where you're not dependent on mom and dad financially, you're not living in their home, generally speaking. I do some things where we help people make this specific, but generally that's that line. Then the second phase is the one you were referring to, and it's usually when we're in our 20s and 30s. It's like whether we're throwing touchdown passes in the NFL, we're a mom at home, we're starting a business in Omaha, whatever it is you're doing, it's like God's after two things in the bigger picture of things. One is he's trying to build character in you, which if you know that as say a 27-year-old, then you can realize I don't need to get all mad and bitter at my boss here. I need to figure out what's God trying to teach me through them, right?
Mm-hmm.
And because he's trying to add character, because as you'll see in a minute, when you get to the season of life where God pushes it all through you, it's later. And so he's trying to build character. And the second thing in your 20s and 30s primarily is he'll give you glimpses of your calling. In other words, it's like you're going to get this thing where, oh, I wish I could do this every day, but we're not quite there yet. But it's enough for God just to kind of affirm to you you're seeing the right thing or things. Third phase can be could be late 30s, but usually 40s and into your 50s. And so during this phase, God keeps building. And there's, again, two things that are primary here. One is called unique methodologies. And what he means by that is during this season of life, you've kind of discovered your gifts and your strengths, and you're realizing, wow, when I use my gifts in this way, whatever vocation you're related to, when I use them in this way, in this kind of setting, or with these kind of people, stuff happens. Like, wow, I can see God moving through my life. There's fruit, there's effectiveness, there's good stuff that's happening. So there's kind of a solidifying in your 40s of, if I could say it this way, who you are and who you're not. And you start becoming more and more secure with that and saying, yeah, this is who God's made me to be. Um, and the second piece of that season of 40s and 50s, and this is usually late 40s into 50s, is there's a clarifying of calling where it's like, when you're in your 20s, you got all this stuff out here, and your whole life, as Bobby describes it, narrows, so you become, as you get older, like a laser beam. And so that's kind of that season, those two things. And then you jump into the fourth of 5 seasons, and this is kind of the bullseye. This is what I would call the season where you fully hit your stride. And it's usually late 50s through your 60s, maybe even nudging up because of the age we live to these days into your 70s a bit. But there's, again, two things that happen here. One is you hit your major role. And what Bobby means by your major role, it's kind of the function, the role that God's dreamed about you fulfilling before you even born. But see, he's been methodical to make sure you're prepared for it. All right. And then once you're in your major role, and Bobby usually says somewhere in a couple years, 2, 3 years later, you hit convergence, which if I could make it a math problem, Allison, it'd be this: seasoned, tested character plus a mature use of your gifts plus a God determined sphere of influence, and they all converge. And that's the season of your life that is of most effectiveness, breadth of impact, regardless if we're called to serve 3 people or we're called to serve 3 nations. It doesn't matter. That's where a lot of the massive amount of fruit begins to come in our life. All right. Which is interesting, isn't it? So it means, at your age, what, 29, it's like it's like you told me the other day, so I know. But it's like at your age, it's like you've experienced so much, you have so much added to your character and your tool belt, and God's always developing character along the way. But it's like you could be several years away, right, from hitting your stride, and that should take the pressure off. And
Yeah.
instead, it lets you go, okay, how's God adding in here and tool belt, right? To finish the timeline is 70-ish plus, is Bobby calls it afterglow. And it's the time that we should be, which means we have to have some wholeness inside so our insecurities don't get after us, of letting go of titles and position. So you actually have more time relationally to invest back in 60s, 50s, 40s, 30s, and 20s, right? And younger. And so that's kind of we took a little more time, of course, in that, but presented that with your staff. And yeah, and so if you're in your 20s and 30s, it's always about what God is building in you is more important than what he's doing through you, which when we obey, he does great things, and we can obey all through this. So it's kind of the
Yeah.
behind the scenes look of how God's developing us.
Yeah. Oh, I think that is going to be so helpful for some people to hear. I know I've put pressure on myself even at like 30 to be like, well, I should have had this
Yeah,
figured out by
yeah,
now, or I
yeah,
should be fully 100% into wherever
yeah,
God is calling me.
yeah,
And so
that's
I
right.
think that does relieve some pressure for those
Yeah,
who are in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, even kind of
yeah,
to think like, no, the Lord is still working and
yeah.
developing me in this. I'm curious about if you had, I'm like watching the time here because I could talk to you for like a
We can
lot
talk
longer
good.
here. I've
Yeah.
got so many questions. Yeah. But let me see if I can, I'm going to try to squeeze two in. Let's see if I can
Yeah.
get two more in before our time is
Okay.
up. One is kind of going a different direction a little bit, but I
Okay.
think I'm going to just go there.
Okay.
So I've been a discipleship director at Northway for, in some capacity, for maybe
Yeah.
13 years now.
Yeah.
Something that I have known and seen for a long time, or just experienced anecdotally, is that at many of our campuses, we will have small groups or like discipleship groups, um, co-ed, plenty of co-ed options, but also women's groups and men's groups. And the women's groups are bursting at the seams with, there might be, I can think of a campus that has maybe 20 women's groups that are full and maybe have two men's groups.
Yeah.
And it feels like, are we just doing something wrong? Are we reaching men wrong? I'm curious from your perspective of working specifically in the discipleship world, what you think about that and how we care better for men in our community and what you would say to that.
Yeah. No, that's great. Um, I kind of mentioned this in passing the other day, the bigger picture, when I said, I think God has made men to war. It's like you as ladies do such a better job than us as guys in connecting more easily relationally. And I think that's part of the gap. And
Mm.
so for about a decade, about 10 hours a week, I helped our church. It would have been from 2010 through 2019 with men's stuff. And I just did it as a favor to our pastor. He just said, hey, we've grown as a church. Our men's ministry just used to be we jump in pickup trucks and go help people move. Now we've grown. Can you just, and I said, I'll find 10 hours a week just to help. So I did that. And one of the things that I learned, Allison, was guys don't do as well sitting in a circle talking. They do better while they're doing something. And so when you can create an activity, that's where sometimes guys can do really well with missions trips or they can do with projects. It's in the midst of that where you're, banging a nail, say, into a rooftop that a tornado had blown off, and you just put your hammers down, and for half an hour, you just end up having a heart to heart, and because they've started building trust as they've been working together. And so once that kind of, if I could say it this way, gets hurdled a little bit, then a guy starts valuing okay, let's just sit down and have a cup of coffee and talk. But sometimes to get men there, it's activity, it's doing things together. I have a personal band of brothers that I have walked with now since 2006. So next year will be 20 years. And there's three guys, Jim, Dan, and Bruce. We were just together this morning talking about some stuff via text, a trip we're going to go on and do together. And we meet on a regular basis. It's because of our schedules are very busy. For us, it's only once a month, but it's extended. And so when we're first together, it's just a little guy teasing and talking all that. And then one of them, somebody will say, so Jimmy, how are you doing? And because of the depth of relationship, there's just a quick zip of the heart. here's the good stuff, here's the challenging stuff, here's where I could be pray, and then we get to ask questions. And then when he's done, hey Dave, your turn. Give us. And so we just take the time, and most men, to be really honest, Allison, do not have that. And that's a need for men who are godly and who are growing in the things of God to have, is a band of brothers like that. And so for Jim, Dan, and Bruce and I, there's been trips we've done, like we literally won't get into it, but we caught a 300-pound tuna, and it took all four of us to get it in the boat. Took 2 hours and 10 minutes. And so we all had a chance to feel what that thing felt like, and it finally got in the boat. And but see, we were doing something together. And then when we're sitting back at the little fishing village where we were, then there's the time to say, "Man, wasn't that awesome?" And then it spills over to like, "Hey, how's your wife doing? Remember she was, and you start. So I think that's a really important thing for all of us to understand. For oftentimes with guys, the activity first that bonds them together through doing something, a task, something fun, whatever, then can spill over to where then it's easy to have a cup of coffee and talk. Hope that's
Hmm.
helpful.
Hmm. Yeah, it is. It reminds me of just even conversations about our educational model in America and how it's
Yeah.
really, in many ways, designed for girl students, right? Like this kind of sit down,
Yeah.
uh, do the paperwork
Yeah.
structure, and
Yeah.
then how little boys need movement, maybe. And so maybe
Totally.
there's a sense of that even within our groups as
Yeah.
well, in the way
And
we
you
think
have
about discipleship.
and you have a couple of those little boys.
I do, yeah. You don't love sitting still.
Yeah, that's right.
Like much, yeah, like activity for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, really quick to wrap up our time.
Yep.
I'm curious, and if we can do, I don't know, this might be a longer question, but
Okay.
if you could give one top piece of advice for someone, I guess it's two questions in one. A top piece of advice for someone in the throes of parenting who are thinking about discipling their children. And then one piece of advice for someone who is maybe a spiritual mother or father who is discipling someone younger than them in their faith. What would be your top advice? And maybe it's the same or maybe it's two different
Okay.
ideas.
Yeah, no, great questions. Yeah, I think obviously with both, it starts with relationship, because to the degree that there's relationship, usually there's same degree of authority to speak into somebody's life. I think you and I chatted about this particular thing the other day, and I just, again, JJ that I was just with for lunch, we were talking about this with his new daughter, and it's I remember when Cheryl and I were out on a date in San Jose, and we were in a park, and we made a commitment to one another that no matter what happens in our journey with our children, we're going to have relationship with them. And what I mean by that is not that we're not going to be parents, we're going to be their friends. I don't mean that, because that's something that I watch a lot, where parents so want to be accepted by their children that they try to become peers versus parents. And God has called you to be parents. However, you can find ways to have relationship. And so with both of our children, who are now 41 and 38, our son and our daughter, it's like that's been a priority. And so because of that, we have relationships. So like when I left you guys, Allison, on Sunday, I flew in, the flight was 20, 30 minutes late, but my daughter and her husband picked me at the airport Father's Day, and we drove to go see my wife and my son and his family, and we just spent the evening together. And that's not uncommon. It doesn't happen just on holidays. But I think when it comes to investing in people, I think, Allison, we can get in the mode of what's the tools, what's the teaching, what's the books, and important. I'm not downplaying that. I'm just kind of raising the relational piece to be equal with it, to say that always care about the person first. Relate with them where they are. Look for ways, like one of the phrases the Lord gave us as we were growing our children was, look for ways to serve their dreams. And so Cheryl and I at times would, have to kind of get out of ourselves and what we think they should do, and just realize that, hey, in this season, Malia's totally into photography. Ryan's totally into music, or Ryan's now playing high school football. And, Malia's got her saxophone out. And in each one of those seasons, it wasn't trying to make a career out of it, because it wasn't none of those things became a career for them, but it was an interest. It was where their hearts were. And I think one of the ways that you can further relationship is look for ways to serve your children's dreams. I don't mean being enslaved. I don't mean throwing hundreds, thousands of dollars. I'm also the same guy that will say, Allison, how many soccer teams does your child need to be on, right? To balance, right? But I think it's also looking for ways because your child will always remember. They will always remember when you did this for them, when you did that for them, especially if it's attached to their dream. All of that relationship is enjoyable for the rest of your life, but also when it comes to discipleship, it gives them the trust in you that when you speak into their lives, they're much easier able to receive what you're saying.
Yeah, that's great. Well, Dave, it is always a pleasure to get to spend time with you. Thank you
Thank
for
you.
joining us virtually on the podcast. You just made it back to Tennessee and we're already chatting with you again, but
It's
we
good.
love
Thank
any
you.
time that we get with you. Thanks for being here today.
Yeah, thank you, Allison.